Hello, everyone. Again, I guess I have to stand over here. Thank you for sticking with us for a fantastic day. So we're back for a second panel on Brazil, we're going to have three panelists, all from Brazil, with us, which is fantastic. First, Aldair Rodrigues from Unicamp, Universidade Estadual de Campinas. We'll be talking about interior dimensions of the African diaspora. This font is incredibly small. New evidence about the connections between the Bight Benin and Minas Gerais in Brazil, 18th century. And then Clemente Penna from the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, judicial attachments and the internal slave trade in Brazil, 1830 to 1888. And then finally, Marcelo Santos Matheus from the Instituto Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, the African slave trade to the south of Brazil through Catholic baptisms, 1800 to 1850. I will coordinate questions after each of our speakers speak. Ethan will be handling the clock. So we're going to start out with Aldair.
It's not coming.
Okay.
Oh yeah, okay, there you go. Hello everybody, thanks so much to the organizers. Thank you, Dara, for the presentation. The database that I'm going to talk about here, it's about the enslaved population who were living in this area of Portuguese America, basically the gold mine and diamond area inland during the 18th century. The main goal of this database is to answer the following question: where the African people who were living there were coming from. For doing this database, for building it, I am using basically notary records, will testament, inventory, manumission, purchase and sale titles, which is escrituras de compra e venda in Portuguese, tax rolls, and Inquisition archives as well. But the main core of it comes from notary records. They are coming from mainly Mariana, which is very close to Vila Rica here in this area, and also they are coming from the diamond area, which was right there. So far we have found 8,000 records. We are going 8,000 records now. Of course, we were not able yet to disambiguate data. Of course, there are more than one person being registered as one person. We have to work that out. We could not afford a technician to help us. This is a very simple database. We have several columns. Each person that we find in the notary records, they gain one row here. So it's oriented in terms of the person, enslaved person. But also we collect data regarding the slave owner. That would help us to disambiguate further and also to track people down. And considering that we are working with different kinds of notary records, that would allow us to track people down in different times of their lives. And also that would allow us to see movement of people. Slavery was not something static. People were moving around. Of course, they were not moving freely. There was power relation there. But those are the main aspects that we are working on. So the database in the future is going to be available at this website, Secult Unicamp. It's the university where I teach. We have a session there only for database. There are already several databases in this website, and probably it would be among them. So in terms of data, what we are accomplishing so far, which kind of information those notary records, inquisition records, and also tax record offer us. First, we are considering local, date, name, gender, origin, age, master or owner, slave owner, status, and body marking, scarification, and also relatives in order to allow us to see connection and people from the same family being enslaved in Brazil. What I'm going to focus here is on origin and body marking. I think that would allow us to see new dimension of slave trade and also slavery. And that could add new information about new routes of slave trade, especially inland in Africa. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. And also, I think that scarification in the 18th century, it's something that we have not so far looked into properly. I think there are lots of data that could be very important for us. To give an example about the interior dimension of the African diaspora, I'm going to focus on the Savalu people who were being enslaved in this, sorry, just a minute, in this part of the interior of the Bight of Benin. So they were being enslaved both by Dahomey in the process of expansion northward after encompassing Uida and Aldair Kingdom in the early 1720s. And also they were being enslaved by Oya that would attack them here in order to bring them mainly to Porto Novo and to export them to the Americas and mainly to Brazil during the 18th century, because due to the gold rush in that area of the interior of Portuguese America, tons of people were being enslaved in that context here during mainly the first half of the 18th century, and they were being brought to work in the gold mine area of Portuguese America. So this is a sample that I am projecting here from Testaments of Mariana. The archive is Arquivo da Casa Setecentista de Mariana. And what we can see here in the description of the enslaved people, focusing on their origins, is that going beyond those generic terms that talks about African origins in the 18th century, we can see also very specific terms, for example, the Savalu ethnonym. We can see a few of them here in this table that comprises only data regarding people from West Africa. But I can show you also, this is a testament where the slave owner declares all the slaves that he owned, and every time that we see an enslaved people being described, we open a new row in the database. So it's oriented towards the enslaved people. Here we can see also Savalu people, where they were coming from. They were living in areas surrounded by Yoruba people. We can see several clusters of Yoruba people here. So it was an area where they were being they were under influence either from Oya or the major power here on the coast, which was Dahomey in the first half of the 18th century. To talk a bit more about the Savalu people and how that can add new evidence for us to understand new routes of the slave trade inland in Africa, I'm going to talk about a sample of 392 people who were living in the village of Tejuco in the mid 18th century. So among them, those 392 people, we had 62 people that were being described as of Savalu nation. So it's, I think, considering that sample, it's an important number. They were a minority in the slave trade, the Savalu people itself, but we could see here a concentration of people from West Africa. And if we focus into the Savalu people, if we look into parish records and other kinds of documents, and if we cross-read that with scholarship on Africa and African history, especially first half of 18th century, and scholarship on slavery as well, if we ask questions like when they were arriving in Brazil, so look into data like year, age in baptism records, and crossing that also with another question like in which context they were being enslaved. If we look into oral traditions in West African history, also maybe in the future historians could look into archaeological data and linguistics and other kind of approach, I think we can start building new evidence that would allow us to understand new routes inland in West Africa. So basically what I'm trying to explain here is that drawing data from the colonial archive in Brazil, in a region that was inland in Portuguese America, we can also understand new dimensions that were going on inland in Africa. So this archive and this database can help us to understand both the African diaspora and also African history. That's basically what I am arguing here, because those data, notary records, tax record, inquisition records, they are more permeable to the daily life of those people, to the social experience of them. So that would allow us to understand new dimension of the slave trade. And going towards the end of my presentation, I would highlight also the importance of body marking and scarification in the colonial record. If you understand that scarification and aesthetic was very important in West African society, especially scarification to express belonging, origin, lineage, status, priesthood, I think that we can see here within the colonial archive the body functioning also as an archive. So scarification, body marks that were being described in the colonial archives works as an archive within the archive. So this database is very open to body markings. I think that could help us to understand new dimensions also of the African diaspora. So the body marks, especially scarification, they were being described through a very racialized lens. We can see here the clerks and the scribes worried about the lips, the shape of the nose, the height, because they were concerned about the suitability to slavery. So it's a very racialized of describing them. But we can also see descriptions of scarification that talks about groupness and origins. So the clerks over time, they started talking about trying to guess the origins of enslaved people, especially Savalu people, according to their facial marks. I'm going to read this just to close my presentation. So we have here in the middle of the 18th century a description of Domingo Sabaru, 20 years of age, with marks of smallpox and 4 small spurs on top of the right eyebrow, and 2 circles cut on the top of the left eyebrow. And in the middle of the eyebrow, a small grid, a star in the corner of the right eyebrow, close to the temple, and all other signs that are on every face of Sabaru. And he worth 300,000 reais. So we can see here a process of knowledge production about African origins within the colonial archives. And the body is working as an archive itself. So we have an archive within the archive. That's what I would like to highlight here, that I think can bring new evidence about the African diaspora and also about African history. Thank you.
Clemente Penna will be getting his presentation. While he's doing that, I have some questions for Aldair. Yes, please switch. Yes. Let's go back. Yes.
From New York University. This is really interesting, really interesting. And I'm curious about the table you showed with the name of the nations. If you were able to find, like, with some precision, the ethnic groups in today or not. And this also made me think about I just read a dissertation from a friend, and he was working on the internal slave trade between Recife and Salvador through the Rio São Francisco to this region. And 18th century was also the time when most of these people from this region arrived in Bahia, and most like from Bahia also to Minas Gerais. So there is also like a connection between the littoral and this region.
Yeah, he basically wants to know more about the nation and ethnonyms to think about the slave trade. But the nations, I think most of people here know, it's very tricky. It's not easy to work with that. I would not assume first that was an ethnic group. Some of them, they are very generic, so you have to look into demographic. You have to try to think also how they were immersed in a broader context. But in the case of Savalu, I am pretty sure it was an ethnic group. I don't know how it was working within the African diaspora, because they were living very close to other people who would also speak Fon. So they started probably changing the way they perceive their origins, and in order to build identities, communities. So there was a lot of things going on in Brazil at that time. So I would think that it's very tricky. In the case of Salvador, it's very clear. It's an ethnic group. But other, like Anago or Anago Nu, that's how the Yoruba people, they are described in those archives. It's more complex, because Nago, it's not easy to know from which subgroups they were coming from, and also Mina, which is very generic. So we have to cross-read that with several other kinds of evidences. Yeah.
So actually, I think just for time, Ethan, one more question?
Probably one more if it's short.
One more question? Yes, Kathy.
So with Domingo Savaru, what did those scars tell us about his origin?
So that's based on what the clerk was seeing when he was describing them. There was a power relation going on there. They were being undressed until the waist. And the clerk probably was comparing them, because there were several Savalus in that community. It's a small village. So the process of knowledge production is permeated by the social experience of living within them. The clerk was Portuguese, for sure. And probably he was using interpreters to describe and to ask them where they were coming from. And I say that because over time you can see that the clerk was using phone words to talk about scarifications. So it was not just the clerk and Domingo Savaru. There was a whole bunch of social dynamics going on there, social relations permeating that process of describing and trying to guess the origin according to scarification. So
you haven't looked at what the scars mean, like the two circles over the
yeah.
right eye and the grid in the middle of the forehead.
Yeah, so I think there's also a process of building stereotypes about African origins. This process of building ideas about groupness and African origin and blackness here in the colonial archive. Because when you see other groups of Nação Fon or Nação Nago, it's very clear they're very different from Fon people, because there is parallel lines. But it's not different from other subgroups, other Guibé-speaking subgroups. So I think that there is a process of building stereotypes here. What I'm going to focus on my project, this is for my book mainly, but also I started recruiting students for this project. But what I have seen, I can decipher the meaning of scarification regarding priesthood. And it's very clear that, for example, priests of the Vodou Dangbe, they had scars of, with shaped as snakes, the piton probably. Yeah. So it's really, I am interested in what that really meant in Africa, but the process of describing it, the power relation that were underlying this process of describing African origins, and the process of building stereotypes about Africanness that would also be related to the process of building ideas of blackness in Brazil in this time, how that was used in scarification to build stereotypes. So it's both the African diaspora and African history that interests me.
Thank you. I think we're going to move on. Clemente, thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. I would thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here and present my research to such an outstanding group of scholars. So what I'm be presenting here today, it's two databases that I'm using in my PhD dissertation. And the databases, they don't deal specifically with slavery. They are about credit, private credit market in the city of Rio de Janeiro. And what I'm trying to do, I hope I will convince you by the end of the presentation that by tapping into the private credit networks in Rio, we can understand slavery a little bit better, and especially the internal slave trade. So for the first databases, the sources I'm using the documents from a institution in Rio that is called the Public Warehouse. So the Public Warehouse is part of the court system in Rio, and it's a facility that houses all of the assets that are being seized in that litigation. So everything that has been seized as a collateral for that goes to, not all of that, but goes to this public warehouse. Sometimes it can go to a private guardian, but I'm be dealing only with the things that went to the public warehouse. So this public warehouse fund, it's in the Arquivo Público do Estado, do Rio de Janeiro, and it's made of 36 books that covers the years of 1829 to 1888, and it has an average of 250 individual entries per book. But this 250 individual entries, this is a work in progress. I only finished the books until from 1829 to 1854. So after 1854, especially in the 1860s and 70s, the number of entries per book will go much higher, will have around 1,000. So, but by the 1850s, where we have, it's around 250 individual entries per book. So the most common documents in these books is the mandados de levantamento. It's a sort of a release order. They're usually a single-page document that authorizes a person, the judge signs authorizing someone to go to the public warehouse and take that asset home. So this is basically what these documents will have. So, okay, over here is the person that required the release order. We have the judge and the court that sign. This is somewhat important because Rio de Janeiro has a vast court system. We have 3 civil courts, 2 family courts, 3 municipal courts, 2 criminal courts, and all the judges, the justice of peace in every parish. So we have there's no short judges in Rio. So over here we have the asset that's being seized. In this case, we have 2 enslaved women, Joaquina Crioula and Fortunata Nina. We have the parts in the litigation, the debtor and the creditor. The result of the litigation, in this case, it was conciliation. So usually we have 3 outcomes. Either the debt will be paid for, or the parts come to an agreement, and the asset will go back to its original owner, or adjudication when the asset goes to the creditor, or it's action out to pay the outstanding debt. So and we have the date over here, and here's the person who signed for the release of the document, of the asset. So this is the database itself. It's a very simple database. I've done a spreadsheet in Excel. And we have over here the type of document, the court, and in column C, it's the most important for our purpose over here, is what asset has been put in the warehouse. So we have slaves, we have furniture, clothing, all sorts of thing has been seized as collateral for that. So, and here we have the names, all the parts, and as you can see, it's a lot of names. So we have who require, debtor and creditor, a little overview of the litigation, and here the outcome. So some of the findings I come so far. So close to 70% of all the assets seized in that litigations from the public warehouse, from the 3,100 that I done so far, are from slaves. So slaves are a very important part of this private credit network in Rio. The other thing that we can do apart from kind of grasping the centrality of slavery for the credit networks, we can identify individuals and companies that are recurrently buying slaves in auction. So with this set of information in mind, that these names of individual and companies, what I'm trying to do now is cross this information with other databases, the newspaper database that we have in Biblioteca Nacional, the Judicial record database in Arquivo Nacional, so we have a lot of suits and civil cases. They're all valid by the Arquivo Nacional, so we can find these individuals if they sue someone, if they've been sued by someone. So we have the information there. And there's the second database that I'm building, there is called the Bills of Credit database. It's a specific book in the notaries where just all the promissory notes or IOUs. So very simple document. I, Clemente, owe $500 to João, and I'll pay in 2 months. So this database has 2,800 entries and contains names of creditors and debtors, the value and type of loan, if it's going to be paid in cash, goods or service, the length, dates, the location, and interest rates. So over here, we have a little snapshot of how that bills of credit database look like. So again, we have a bunch of debtors and creditors and how it's paid for, the amount, where it is signed. So the bill of credit, they're sort of a global document because it's based on the bills of exchange, so it's used throughout the Spanish and Portuguese America and United States. So it's a document that we have in a lot of places. So this is an interesting thing because we can cross with some other places. So the potential I found so far, it's that by crossing the informations that I found, in these two databases, can help us to understand, especially to me, the relationship between slavery and this private credit networks, because slave property really hold this credit market together. So all the money that was invested in slaves went to give security to a lot of credit transactions that are going in the city of Rio. And by looking to these individuals that are buying slaves in auction in bulk, we can somewhat identify the agents in this internal slave market and do sort of, understand a little bit more the financial size of slavery and how this credit networks might help us understand a little bit more about slavery in Brazil itself, and especially the slave trade. So the internal slave trade, especially the internal slave trade, because what I found so far is that we have a bunch of, we have a bunch of what they call commission, the commission office in Brazil, that they deal with credit, they deal with this sort of a pawn shop, a labor agency, all in one place. You can go there and you can buy a slave, you can do a real estate business. So we have a lot of this sort of credit agents that will deal a lot with slaves and with the internal slave trade. So that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.
Questions? Yes.
Are you saying, did you find that the slaves were housed in these warehouses along with the chairs and the furniture?
Yes.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, she's asking if the slaves were physically housed in the warehouse. It's one warehouse. It's one large complex of buildings. If they were housed together with the furniture, clothing, yes.
And did the time frame of retrieving or paying for them, how long might they stay there? That really depends.
most of that litigation were quick, 3-4 months.
Months?
Yeah, but that's the thing. The public warehouse can rent the slaves out to pay for food and for to feed the slaves. They will rent the slaves out and use that money to pay for the food. So it's a very busy place, the public warehouse. You have a bunch of slaves, so furniture coming in and out, and ox carts and animals are being housed over there. So yeah.
Where is it? Campo de Aclamação?
Gamboa. Yeah, it's close to the port.
So very close to the old slave port
Yes.
as well.
And that's a
Yes.
dynamic that you should add to the internal, this new dimension that you're talking about.
Come in.
I would recommend that as you discuss the warehouse and the business section as a new dimension of the slave trade, that you add minimally that they were housed in the warehouse, but there was a subcontracting of those bodies forever. Do you follow me? That's a different, that's another
No,
dimension.
there's a very important human aspect to this auctions, because sometimes you're going to have lifelong companions of one slave owner being separated because of a death. So you have a wife and a husband being sold out to pay for the death. And yes, this dimension and this functioning of the warehouse, it's an important part of the research, how this worked out, because it was, we have sometimes close to 50 slaves in a week coming in and out of the public warehouse, so it's very busy. And
Paul and then John.
Yes, since these slaves were sometimes working outside, are their names recorded and are details about them in case they should respond or something?
yes, in the release orders we have the name of the parts in the litigation, who the slave belonged to, and their name, and if they're Brazilian born, or if they're African, we have the nation. If they are from Angola, Congo, Benguela, and how they control this renting out of slaves. It's pretty much like they go into this huge market for slave rents in Rio. So they will announce in the newspaper the public warehouse has 5 slaves to rent. One is a cook, another one is, and this we can find in the newspaper database. So we had to cross this information. The public warehouse documents itself, it's short in information. We have names, number of slaves, and sometimes their age, most of the time just name, and if they're Brazilian born or if they're African.
Go ahead.
Yes, Harvard University. We discussed this for a moment at lunch, but could you explain something more about how, getting loans, etc., based on slavery actually worked? Is it that those people were seen as an asset which was used to secure the loan, or were they part of paying back the loan? Did they also work to pay back the loan? Because you mentioned this warehouse construction, which they actually works for their food, more or less. How does it work?
So
Did you repeat the question?
So it's asking me how this loan system worked in Brazil. The slaves were used as collateral in the debt, and if the slave labor or the service of that slave can be used to pay for the debt. So that's the thing about the private credit market in Rio. We have several options to make a loan. You can pawn out a good. I mean, you can get a piece of jewelry and give as a collateral to get a loan, or you can actually pawn a slave. You can go to one of those commission agents and so here's my slave. You can keep him for a couple of months and give me $200 for this couple of months. If I don't pay back, you keep the slave. In this particular case, what we have is a credit contract that has no collateral. I give you $200 and a date, and you sign, and I have to go, if you don't pay, I have to go to the courts and start that litigation. So you're gonna have any kind of asset seized as security for the outstanding debt. So, so in that case, the slavery itself is not being used as collateral directly in this credit transactions, but as we can see, it works as sort of a universal debt security in the city of Rio. So in a lot of these conciliations, when they get into agreement, the owner will put the slave to rent the slave and put him to work to pay the outstanding debt. So in a way, yeah, slavery can be used as collateral and used to pay for that.
Right, thank you. I think we're out of time, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Marcelo,
Oh,
you have
no
next.
problem. Thank you. Okay. This has to be flipped under your collar. Yeah. Here, you hold that. That goes in your pocket. Should do it. You just put it in your pocket or clip it or whatever. This one.
Pocket?
Okay.
Hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank everyone at Michigan State University for making this Congress possible and to help me to be here today. I very much look forward to your comments and questions in our discussion. I usually avoid reading when presenting a paper. However, there are two reasons for me to do so today. Firstly, because the level of my English is something that I think you should have noticed by now. And second, because I don't want to speak longer than the 12 minutes that I have been given. So I read, but I forgot my glasses in the airplane. And without them, I can read near from the, so that's a problem, but I am a historian of 19th century history of Brazil, interested in the slave system and African slave trade. And my talk today focuses on how we can use Catholic Church records to study the slave trade and the lives of Africans and their descendants. My analysis focuses on a specific region in southern Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, a frontier area with Spanish Empire and later on with Uruguay and Argentina, that used to produce salt beef in 19th century and that were connected to the transatlantic slave trade via its port. The livestock production in this green area was sold to charqueadas in Pelotas that produced salt beef that was sold by Rio Grande port to other parts of Brazil, Europe, and Cuba, and other parts. There, slaves from several parts of Africa arrived constantly. As I will show today, in order to study the deep connections between the southern Brazilian borderlands and the Atlantic slave trade, I use baptismal records. It's important to say that for a long time, this region was almost forgotten when we talk about slavery or slave trade in Brazil, a place where slavery would have been of a little importance, but nothing could be further from the truth. So let's go. As you can see in the image, on December 6, in 1806, in the parish of Rio Grande, the priest João da Cunha Pereira baptized the adults, Antonio and Francisco. Antonio and Francisco were Africans of the Minas nation and probably had just arrived in Brazil. But why were Antonio and Francisco baptized? They were baptized because the law demanded so. Which law? The first constitution of the Archbishop of Bahia. During the Portuguese Empire, when Brazil was a colony, or even when Brazil had become independent, never there had been a wider law in Brazil to rule over the relationship between masters and slaves. There wasn't any law, at least until 1871, until the Rio Branco Law, or Free One Law, as Rio Branco Law was called. Until then, the state almost didn't regulate slavery in Brazil. For instance, until 1871, there wasn't a central law that forbade or regulated the process of manumission, for example, something that existed here in some states of USA. In summary, the slavery relationships were generally defined inside the slave owner's house. Even the 1824 Constitution didn't deal with slavery, for example. To avoid imprecisions, I must say that there was one quite broad regulation, precisely the first Constitution of Bahia, published in the first half of the 18th century. What are the Constitution about, you may be wondering? It's a long document which deals with several aspects of Brazil's religious life, and among other issues, it brings up the subject of converting Africans to Christianism. Therefore, amongst other regulations, it compels the masters to baptize all the slaves, being they born in Brazil or being them African, and compels the priests from all parishes to check this matter. Just to remember, Brazil was, and still is, a Catholic society, a God-fearing society. The priests, for instance, were paid by the state until the proclamation of the Republic in 1889. So, the only law that governed the relationship between masters and slaves during the colonial and post-colonial period until 1871 was the constitutions. It was also important to say that the constitutions as a law continued to be valid until the second half of the 19th century. That being said, according to the research of Gabriel Berucci and Gabriel Aldair, we know that between the end of 18th century and about 1835, about 35,000 slaves disembarked in Rio Grande do Sul, most of them coming from Recife, Salvador, and mainly from Rio de Janeiro. Few slaves came to Rio Grande do Sul from the African continent itself. From those 35,000 slaves, nearly 75% of them were African. We thus have an estimated 30,000 Africans reaching the shores of Rio Grande do Sul in that period. Nevertheless, when we try to know more about the lives of those Africans, we usually use sources with qualitative information. We don't know, for example, where they were sent after going to Rio Grande do Sul. I mean, to which locations in the province's countryside they sent to. We have just a few demography surveys that display the features of the slave population in detail, especially in relation to those who were Africans and those who were born in Brazil. Just a quick and important note, okay? By studying baptisms of slaves, I'm not supposing they were automatically converted or absorbed by it. No. They kept many of their traditions and religions, of course. So, since you have a documental void to where the Africans were sent after arriving in Rio Grande's ports, I reached my research problem in are the baptismal records useful for the study of the African slave trade to Brazil? Having answered that question, something I already done and others researchers already have done, I moved on to another question. How many slaves were baptized in Rio Grande do Sul between 1780 and 1850? The period of time used here can be explained because it is from this moment on Brazil becomes the biggest destination of enslaved Africans in the Americas, as you can see in the blue line. So from that question, the research objectives became identify the origins of the baptized Africans as for their nations and their broad regions, characterizing the baptized Africans in terms of gender, quantify which final destinations received more Africans, and verifying the representativity of Africans in the total number of slave baptisms. Having that in mind, what I present now are the first results of the research, results just for this first region, Porto Charqueadora, composed by these 5 chapels, Rio Grande, Povo Novo, São José do Norte, Pelotas, and Estreito, and between 1800 and 1850. This is a screenshot of my database. Until the present moment, almost 9,000 baptism records from these 5 chapels have already been recorded. As you can see, about 22% of baptisms were of Africans, meaning that the most of the baptized slaves were born in Brazil. About 54% of the baptized slaves were men. However, when we focus only on the African slaves, over 70% of them were men. Finally, the majority of African slaves were from the central region of Africa. The region of orange lines. The central region of Africa, as you can see in the patches that are bold and underlined. Okay? But the number of Minas is significant, of course. To conclude, I would like to make 3 quick comments. First, yes, I believe it is possible to state that the baptisms are useful for the study of the Atlantic slave trade. We must be careful when we use the source, must be careful in which questions to ask, but this is indeed a precious source. Nonetheless, baptisms are useful for other purposes. In my PhD thesis, for example, I used them to study migration, to study slave demography, to study Africanity, and as important as that, to study kinship alliances between slaves and freed slaves and other people. For example, it wasn't hard to find a godfather or a godmother paying for the manumission of his or her godchild. If you do not want to waste the time on reading an entire thesis, there is an experiment which I have just discussed in the paper The Mina Coast African, Maria Francisca do Rosário. It's fine, okay. Joining these 2 aspects, I believe that the baptism records can be of a great assistance to the great objective of the Enslaved Hub. There is to build the link, the open data, which is one of the reasons for this Congress. And all of that for a single reason. The baptism brings the name of those involved in the ritual, which is almost essential to find the same slave or free slave in different sources. Thank you all for the attention.
I was wondering, one of the, trying to work on the kind of the same subject, and one of the probably sources, entries of those Africans is it through Montevideo, and they would go north. So I was wondering if the databases that you're using in any way overlaps or is using similar data of the ones that Uruguay was developing through Uruguay, especially the entries on the La Plata. And the other thing is whether, the baptisms, if you separate the ones who are children and the ones who are adults, the adults can directly lead you to the illegal enslavement. Crianças, adultos, yeah, the adults. The adults sometimes are the ones who are being illegally enslaved. And there are some of those places where really illegally enslaving free blacks around this area. And I was wondering if there is any way that you could look at those documents, if there are many adults being brought together by the same master, or if you could see a hint on this through the baptism records.
Could you repeat at least one of the questions before you? Let me stand up so they can't really see. You repeat? You could.
No, you can.
Well, give me a prompt on the first question. The second question.
No, for me, no, but for the.
Yeah, you repeat this. Summarize what you're about to answer.
The first one is if it's directly related to the Uruguay.
Uruguay. So
Yeah, I don't think that our slaves come from Uruguay. I think that the most of them, the majority of them came from the second leg of the transatlantic trade. After arriving in Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, and about there is something that I found nearly the 1831, the law that forbids the transatlantic trade. Our masters took their slaves to attack. I think that there was some fear about the law. I think that they would like to show that slaves arrived before the law, the 1831 law. So.
Okay. Yes, please identify yourself.
I don't speak French.
You have to do some translation.
Ma question, c'est que j'ai suivi avec intérêt la présentation, mais j'aimerais savoir si au cours de vos recherches, vous avez seulement rencontré les nagos et les autres peuples. Sinon, chez nous, lorsqu'on parle des nagos, les nagos viennent d'un métissage des Yoruba et des Mari, en quelque sorte. Alors, lorsqu'on prend la période de 1800 à 1850, et qu'on ne trouve pas, en quelque sorte, une partie Yoruba, ça laisse un peu d'inquiétude à la présentation de vos résultats.
I don't speak French and I don't speak English. I just understood Nago.
Basically, the idea is that with the Nago, my colleague is from Benin, where the Nago are from, and the issue is that there with their research, the Nago are actually a métissage of Yoruba and Mari. And have you seen this in your research, or because if you don't take that into account, you may misinterpret the origin of this group. So basically, the issue is you take into account the actual origin of Nago as being a métissage of Yoruba and Mari.
É porque o Nago é muito genérico.
Sim,
então você
I
tem
found
alguns não eram Mari, outros.
I put together Mina and Nago, but the 99% were Mina. A few of the baptized slaves were inscribed Nago. A few.
So you can't figure out from which subgroup you are
No,
coming from.
you talk about
It's very generic.
this Mina is the most difficult. And Nago also is difficult to say if really from that society. So.
But given that these registries that you're working with are for Rio Grande do Sul, but your argument is that these Africans had already arrived in Bahia or Rio.
Yeah.
How much do you attribute their nation to something that had already gone through a process of, you know, some sort of Brazilianization even before the registries that you look at? And then the question is related to what that may relate to then Africa itself.
Yeah, I don't know if I and other researchers have an answer for this. There is a book, the Labyrinth of Nations,
The Labyrinth of Nations.
Labyrinth of Nations, that the writers asked what we have, what we could call this or other nation. It's difficult to say. I think that there were interpretation of what people believe belong. So I think that it's difficult to say that it's really from Nago, it's really from, especially Guinea Nago, not Cabinda, the Congo, Bengal. I found two priests that worked about 10 years, one in Benguela and another in Angola. And after working in the parishes of Rio Grande. Rio Grande do Sul. So this is a how can I say?
It has some hints of what
Yeah, they understood that people from these societies. And Mina and all smart people.
Okay, I'm sorry we're out of time, but I want to thank Marcelo.
We're running a smidge behind, so we're going to just take a quick 5-minute break and do a turnaround. After which we'll have our last panel of the day. So don't go too far. Or don't go anywhere.
Hello, are you next? Yes, and the first 2 presentations are on this one. The 4th one's on a laptop. The 3rd one is